All right, as we come back together, I want to start by seeing if you all have any questions that you would like to ask from anything we've talked about this morning. I used to say that, is there anything you'd like to bring up after lunch? But that's not the best way to put it. I realize that at this point. But yes, ma'am.
How would you explain the difference between a door number 2 church and a door number 3 church?
Well, I think a door number 2 is really what people refer to as a seeker church, where the prominence is really all year and in most expressions geared to unbelievers. Now, not true. I mean, you look at a lot of discipleship material that's come out of both Saddleback and even over the years, Willow and other churches like that. But what you're saying in door number 3, I think, are two things. One is we're willing to take some Sundays and have those Sundays be more for seekers, so that, say, when you do a preschool graduation or whatever it might be, some churches will do a whole thing for teachers in the community or whatever. At that point, you're really saying that Sunday is more of a seeker service, even though that's not mostly what we do. But the other pieces with door number 3 is we want to try and take every ministry and make sure it has some kind of evangelistic outreach element in it, so that we are at least aligned throughout the ministries of the church in terms, so it's not just what happens on Sunday morning. Okay?
It seems like it would be like the plant. Our plant is really a number 2 church because their focus.
Okay, all right. It could be, yeah. And I'm just not aware that much about where that is, but sure. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
When you're talking about these bridging events, these big events that are going to be bridging, as someone who has organized the same thing as previous at the church, I think our biggest issue is sometimes finding the volunteers and having it be a whole church
Right.
event. It's
Right.
more just, oh, that's children's ministry. So how do you get your volunteers and people to embrace that concept for goal?
Well, how do you get several things? One is volunteers. How do you get volunteers, to embrace is two things. I'm going to talk this part of this afternoon that one of the responsibilities of all leadership is the development of more leaders. Churches grow as you multiply groups and as you multiply leaders. Churches do tend to multiply groups, whether it's in mid-sized groups, small groups, etc. Most churches really don't focus on developing leaders. And anymore, when people say, we can't find leaders, I said, don't worry about it. You're supposed to be developing them, okay? So that's part of it. Secondly, when things are constantly tied into the vision and mission, I find it begins to change often, that people want to do this. And so for example, even as you get new people into the church through your connection process, when you do big events, I would go to a bunch of them and have them, whether it's doing parking, whether it's doing guest relations, whatever. And sometimes your best guest relations are the people who are new, who are raving fans about what's going on. But part of it also has to do with mission and vision and an excitement. One of the eco churches that went through this, that's part of the cohort that Phil is in, I'm going to talk about children's ministry, and this was a smaller congregation, and as they were praying, now this doesn't happen to every church, but as they were praying, a couple shows up, a family shows up one Sunday, and the pastor begins to talk to them, and they live about an hour away, and they said, God told us we need to be here at this church, and we want to help you with children's ministry, bringing all kinds of experience with effective children's ministry. So again, it's that praying the Lord of the harvest that he will be raising up laborers. Okay? All right? Okay?
I got a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Still more nuts and bolts, but so there's a lot of sort of side doors, side ministries to the church.
Yeah.
That don't necessarily plug directly into the church, into, say, Sunday worship.
Yeah.
Should that be some part of the goal of getting people to, as we thinking in terms of next steps, are we trying to get them to step into Sunday worship?
Well, I'm not sure necessarily. Hopefully people come into Sunday worship because it's worth coming into and it's a good experience. But if people come into the church through the side door, I'm more concerned that the side door, in somehow in the process of ministering through that side door, at some point people are challenged with their responsibility to follow Jesus. Okay, I'm more so. For example, I mentioned you have a MOPS program. There were 3 women in Denver who started MOPS, and one was in our church. So at our peak, we had 4 MOPS programs at that point. But take MOPS. If MOPS is doing what MOPS is supposed to do, at some point there's a presentation of the gospel. And also hopefully there's in culturally relevant ways in which the gospel is connected. Whether those, and by the way, if those women who come to Christ decide to go to another church, that's fine. Okay. This point is where you're saying I want to look at the kingdom ministry. I hope you hear balance in this. So I know I tend to speak to extremes, but I hope you hear balance. Okay. I believe Jesus calls us to feed people, to give those who are thirsty, prisoners, that there is a sense in which we are to do the great commandment. So I believe in that. Our church did that. I mean, the church in Denver today, for example, has a mother who had 2 children, but then they adopted a mother and a father adopted a foster child that almost drove them nuts, stayed with it, and now today in that county where that church is, any child that becomes adoptable in the foster program, they get their portrait picture taken, and they provide traveling displays in churches for a month. When you walk out of church, there's all these easels with these foster kids that are adoptable. And 2 years ago, in their county, they saw 50 of those children adopted by Christian parents. Okay, so that's part of the great commandment. But the other side of it is that also needs to be in balance. Jesus is not calling us to help people go to hell more comfortably. Okay? I mean, if you think about it, the biggest problem anybody has is not hunger, it's not cold, it's not education, it's separation from God. And that's why Jesus came. Okay? And so somehow that's what I'm concerned, that balance is kept. Does that answer the question, Robbie?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am. Don't worry. I won't blame you if we get out late. Go ahead. I'm kidding. All right. I'm kidding. Now, what's your question? What's the okay.
You might be addressing these in what's
Okay.
your next section. My first question is, so we talked about the V,
Yeah.
the vision, which I feel like sometimes you can set that and it can be great, but do you find that the M and the S are hard to like carry out? Because I feel like if you have a vision but you don't have the plan to follow through with it and like make that happen, I don't know, I just feel like we can say we are Fuller County, but then we're like, what are we doing to make that happen?
Okay.
It's hard.
Well, I think the balance is this. The M and the S often are where consistency in the implementation of the vision and mission occur. However, you never start with structure. You always start with vision, because vision is about hope. So you're always starting with hope and to say, this is what we want to accomplish. Now, if you're going to do the vision I've suggested for you, right now there's a lot of things that have to change in terms of the M and the S to bring it into consistency with the vision and mission. And if those things don't change, the vision and mission will not be accomplished. Okay?
So then my question is, for, making those difficult choices to make changes, you obviously are gonna have some people push back on that.
Oh, yes.
So are you gonna equip us with language to use in how to address those people?
To some degree, I can't deal with everything, but here's what I'm saying is I would do 2 things, is to say, folks, well, let me talk about this. I'll give you some key language. The first prescription, which I have not talked about, is the most important prescription. There's only one command in the Great Commission: make disciples. Okay? Everything else is in your teaching, in your baptizing, make disciples. That is a command. Okay? So, if your church is not consistently doing the Great Commission, and by the way, I said this to our churches in Northern California, you're not doing it, that's disobedience. That is your biggest problem. Now, here's what I find. With Christians, often there's a reaction. In fact, I've been told several times after I've done this with eco churches, I can't believe you were so nasty, because I was saying it's disobedience. Well, I don't know what else it is. I mean, most churches have ended into a codependent relationship with the evil one. I mean, if you think about it. So it is disobedience, but it's also the easiest one to deal with. Because when you come to God and say, forgive me, what does God do? He forgives. So the first prescription will be that if you decide you want to do this, within a month or two from that decision, you need to have a Sunday where all the congregations come together, and that whole service is dedicated to prayers of repentance and forgiveness, saying, God, forgive us for what we're doing. To have people actually get on their knees and say, God, would you break our hearts for people who don't know you? I find most Christians in the United States, and I'll include myself at times, my heart is not broken for people who don't know Jesus. I mean, every once in a while it hits me as I get on an airplane, because I'm on airplanes. As people come on, most of these people don't know Jesus. And part of that, not all, I'm not taking responsibility, but part of that is because I haven't done what I'm supposed to do. So to come to God and say, break our hearts, give us a passion. Okay, so first of all this is centered to say, how can we as a church again be obedient? Which means putting Jesus first. Putting Jesus above our building, putting Jesus above our traditions, if need be, putting Jesus above our polity, putting above whatever. Okay, so that's part of the language that needs to come, but then you always tie what you're doing to the vision and the mission. So that's the language that has to be used, and I will be sharing some of that there. Now, by the way, on that day of prayer, when you're done, the prescription reads, you will divide up into groups and prayer drive the area. Okay? And begin to go all over, no matter what. And here I would say, Mike, any part where you feel the church is connecting. If it's in West County, fine. If it's not. But you go all over the area and begin to pray. And by the way, you will have to train the people who are driving the car. Now, the only ones who get to pray with their eyes open is the driver. Okay, all right. But and then you have to train the congregation to pray. People in the churches are not used to praying for the lost. So the Eco Church up in Rome, Pennsylvania, out in the middle of nowhere, northeast Pennsylvania, little town of 400. When they did this, one of the people was a high school teacher. Put 3 or 4 people in their car, most of them older, went up to the high school and drove around the high school and stopped at every doorway into the high school and told them what goes on in the high school. Then they began to pray for those who teach science, for the students that are in there. Got to the next, there's home ec, and then they began to pray for them. Took them around there. The Eco Church in south of the Dulles Airport in Centerville, one car on the way out to pray for this particular area came back and they went by a community college. That wasn't on their list, but God said, go in there and pray. They went in there and prayed. And out of that now has come a whole ministry to that community college because God began to break their hearts for that college. I was working with a church in Queens, New York, almost out to Long Island, almost out there. And this church in the 50s and 60s was a church 500, 600, maybe a little bit larger. And the pastor literally every week had a half-an-hour Bible study on WOR radio in New York City, which was what they call a flamethrower station. Any of you old enough to remember Bob and Ray? Bob and Ray was on that station. Sorry, I'm old. But anyway, actually the Bible study. And when I got there, they said, we have been watching every church in our denomination from Manhattan die. So right now, in our church, there are no other churches from our denomination in that line, and we think we're next. Now, when they did the day of prayer, all the African Americans lived on that side of the church. All the Indians, Sikh and Hindu, lived across the street. There was a Sikh temple. And all the Caucasians lived that. So they didn't have to prayer drive. They prayer walked. Well, one of the elders said, I believe we all do this, but I'm not going to lead a team to prayer walk. And the pastor said, yes, you are. He said, all right, I'll go to the Caucasians. He said, no, you don't. You're going to cross the street to the Indians. He said, I don't like the Indians. He says, that's why you need to go. So he took his team, and they're going down by front of every store, and they're praying for the people in that store that somehow God will help open their hearts and give them an entree. They go around the corner, and there's a restaurant, and they're standing there praying, and what they find out is the owner comes out. He said, what are you doing? He said, we're praying. What are you praying for? We're praying for you. We're praying for your restaurant. We're praying that God will bless you. You can see the church. We're from that church. And he said to them, I'm Indian, but I'm neither Sikh nor Hindu, and nobody in this community likes me. And you came over and prayed for me. Gets his keys out, locks up the restaurant. That's what are you doing? He said, I'm going back to church with you. You people love me. He's in that church now. Okay. That's what happens on that day of prayer. Okay. And and then come back, you share your stories, and then have communion together. That's the start of the new life cycle. It starts on your knees. And that's where it's got to begin. That's the most important of all the prescriptions. To God, break our heart for that, what's there. Now, having said that, I want to share with you a fourth assumption. And here's the basis and then I'll get, I've lost my my markers here, excuse me. I have never seen a church turn around without people leaving. By the way, if you're serious about doing the Great Commission, the evil one will not be delighted. So recognize it won't always be easy. Most evangelical churches in the United States are playing for the wrong team. And it's time to come back and say we're going to play for the right team. And we're going to do it the right way. Okay? So, churches from 0 to 200 are like apples. 80% of all churches in the United States never get past 200. Now, you've broken that barrier, and you broke it a long time ago, and you're still above that barrier, but most churches never get past 200. Churches from 200 to 1,000 are like oranges. Okay? Now, I'm using the whole thing, we're talking about apples and oranges. So don't get hung up on the metaphor. If that doesn't work, use dogs and cats. Okay? But they're different at this point. Churches from 1,000, there are now churches in Latin America, over 40,000, that are less than 15 years old because so many people are coming to Jesus, are simply bigger oranges. Okay. Now, here's the concept. Large churches are large because they're designed to be large. Small churches are small because they're designed to be small. It's not just an issue of quantity, it's an issue of quality. And when churches are in decline for a long time, they tend to gravitate back to an apple. Family is important. Relationships, now hear me well, I'm not saying they're unimportant, but relationships trump mission. And I've heard about that in your church. We can't make this decision because of who's going to get hurt. Folks, that excuse did not work at Nuremberg. I had to kill those Jews because otherwise the general told me to. You still were hanged. Okay. And so we have to understand that mission has to trump everything. One of the passages that always impresses me is in Mark 2, where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And that night when the Sabbath is over, it says the streets are just filled with sick people. I think it's because the kids were out playing and told everybody because it was the Sabbath. Sabbath's over, and he heals everybody. Next morning, the disciples can't find Jesus because he's out of town praying. They go out to him and say, there are more people that need to be healed. And Jesus said, I understand, but we have to go to this town. I have a mission. Now, most of us who are pastors say, I got to go back and do that. It's very interesting when Jesus dies in his prayer in John 17, he says to his Father, I have completed everything you told me. A lot of people hadn't been healed. A lot of people hadn't been raised. A lot of poor people hadn't been helped. A lot of people never heard Jesus preach. But he came to do the mission. And the mission of Jesus trumps everything. So, what we've said to churches is, when I work with most churches under here, I teach them how to act. I teach apples how to act like an orange. Okay? So, one of the smallest churches I've worked with, about 10 years ago now, I was invited to a church in Maine. Now, people, even people, I am from New Jersey originally, even we don't know what Mainers are like. They're the most independent people there are. Okay, I mean, they were here before the American Revolution and they'll be here afterwards. And as a result, change is a 4-letter word. Okay. Little church, the little town of 15,000 up in the middle of Maine, nothing around it but mountains and trees. I said to the nomination person, tell me about the church. He said, well, the church is over 200 years old. In fact, their building this year is celebrating its 200th birthday. And it is a historic landmark. It seats 300, and it's kept in pristine condition. And 9 o'clock every Sunday morning, they play the chimes, and the town says, isn't that quaint? And I said to him, you have not told me a word about the church. The church is people. I said, how many people are there? He said, well, on a good Sunday, they have 23. Okay. I said, well, you want me to work with that? I said, thanks for giving me one of your better churches. Okay. So I get up there. I start on a Friday because there's not many people. The pastor's just gotten out of seminary, and he was so naive, he didn't know he shouldn't have gone there. But he needed a job. You know, he's got to do something. Okay. Good guy, great guy, but no idea what to do. They had a volunteer church secretary, I think was in her 80s, so I interviewed her. We hollered at each other for about 30 minutes. Okay. So on Friday night, I did a focus group. Well, when you only have 23 people, that is a focus group. So I had all 23 people there. So Saturday, when we sat here, it was all 23 people. And I sensed once again, these people wanted God to work through them to minister to their community. So I said to him, you got to change. Some old guy, literally. What's the first change? I said, all right, I want to ask you a question. Now, I knew the answer to this question, and you should know the answer when I tell you what it is. I said, where do you sit on Sunday? Well, you know where they sat. All 23 people sat scattered across the back of a 300-seat auditorium. You could have shot a machine gun through there and missed them all. I said, tomorrow when I get up to preach, I'm going to ask you, if you're open to doing this, I'd like to see all of you in the first 8 pews. I said, we'll give you maps. We'll dust them off. I did not think they would do it. Sunday morning, I got up, and there's 23 people in the first 8 pews. I said, thank you. I mean, I'm impressed. But here's the deal. If you're just here this Sunday for me, and next Sunday you're going to be like Norm on Cheers with his stool. You're going back to your pew. Okay. And if a visitor gets lost and finds your church by accident, they have to walk past all 23 of you and look like a big red pimple on somebody's nose. I'm glad you're here today, but it's not going to help. Are you willing to be in those pews 8 weeks from now? So if a visitor walks in, they say, there may not be many people here, but at least they're interested enough to be up front. So I left. Never heard a word. 4 years later, I'm actually in Kansas City at a conference, and I see the denominational leader. I said, whatever happened to that church in Maine? He said, oh, Paul, they're averaging 125. They got families coming. This year they've seen 6 people come to Jesus. They've got kids coming. I said, would you quick email that pastor and tell him Rick Warren cannot compete with your percentages? They had quintupled in 4 years, okay, because we taught them how to act like an orange. Okay? So the question you should be asking is, what does an orange look like? So if you'll turn with me to page 11. Says requirements of a large church. If it helps, just write orange across the top. This is an orange. Number 1. It is staff-led. God in Scripture always works through leaders. As someone who comes out of a congregational background, by the way, I do not believe in congregational government, but I come out of that background. I remind people that every time a large group in Scripture makes a decision, it is always the wrong one. And the reason it's always the wrong one is because they decide about their own self-interest, not about the mission. So, it's staff-led. Here's the strategy. Culturally assumed ministries of a congregation are led well. Notice I did not say biblically assumed ministries, because most of what we do in church is not in the Bible. Nurseries are not in the Bible. Sunday school's not in the Bible. Youth group's not in the Bible. What we do is we take biblical principles and say, how does it fit our culture? Okay? The reason why African American services are generally longer is because during the slave days, the only day they were free from the white master was Sunday when they were in church, and they made the service last for 6 hours. It took 30 minutes to take up the offering, and they had no money. Okay. So basically, the culture of the day is, how do we go back to your question, how do we take the biblical truth and put it in a way that the people in the culture will respond to it? Okay? Now, culturally assumed ministries of a congregation are led well. Why do they need to be led well? In order to transform consumers into fully committed disciples of Jesus Christ. Everybody comes to the church as a consumer. Even unbelievers, unchurched people, de-churched people, semi-church come as consumers. Will you help me with my family? Will you help me with my marriage? Will you help me with this need? They want help. The problem is, we who are in the church all the time, we are far more finicky about our consumer demands. Okay? In other words, are you going to have my music? Are you going to have my children? Are you going to have a youth group that does this? Are you going to preach this way? Are you going to do this? Because if you're not, remember I said, I'll shop for another church. Okay. So, what you're trying to do, first of all, with the believers, is to say, how do we move you from consumerism to a fully devoted follower of Christ? Now, we've all heard that term, so I want to give you my best example of what a fully devoted follower of Christ is. When our region was in the process of turning around and we began to get some critical mass, usually once a year or every 18 months, we would take 10 to 12 of our pastors on a field trip. And we would go to some church that was running very effective ministries, either in certain areas of the whole church, and we say, we got to go learn. Well, during that time, there was a guy by the name of Dan Sutherland who had gone to Flamingo Road Baptist Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Southern Baptist Church, but Dan had just written a book called Transition, about how you transition or lead a church through transformation. He got to the church, he was there I think about 20 years. When he got there, the church was 300. The previous pastor had an affair. The treasurer had absconded with some of the funds. The church was filled with fights and whatever. And so when Dan came in, Dan said, we've got to address these issues. But number one, we've got to make our first priority making new disciples for Jesus Christ. And he began to basically implement a saddleback model of ministry. So they were doing 101, 201, 301, 401, for those of you who are familiar with that process of discipleship. The church began to grow. When they got to about 1,000, the church built a new building, and he put on the conference. He had written the book. So we took a bunch of pastors to his conference. Well, at the conference, he mentioned that they had a group in their church called the Cotton Ball Club. So I went up to him during the break and I said, "What's the Cotton Ball Club?" He said, "Well, there's about 6 of them right over there. Why don't you go ask them?" And I look over and there's 6 seniors sitting over there, you know. So I go over and I said, "I understand you're part of the Cotton Ball Club." Somebody says, "Oh yeah, I'm chair. I'm head of it." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "How many are in Cotton Ball Club?" He said, "Well, there's about 100 of us seniors." Okay. I said, I knew the answer to this question because they had 3 services Sunday morning. I said, "Which service do you go to?" "Well, 11 o'clock, because, you know, that's in Thessalonians. You go to church at 11 o'clock. They had kind of a theater seating. It was all theater seats and kind of in the... Again, I knew the... I said, "Where do you sit?" They said, "Well, we get there early because all of us want the last seat all the way around." So we sit there. And I sit in the middle. I said, "Okay." And she said, "Now, you know, our music is pretty raucous." I mean, they were basically doing very contemporary Christian music. Some might call it Christian rock. And by the way, Dan's avocation was a drummer. So even if he was in town and he wasn't preaching, he was playing the drums. And she said, "I sit back there every Sunday with 2 bags of cotton balls. And as soon as the band walks out, okay, I open both bags and I put 2 cotton balls in my ear and I send 1 bag this way and 1 bag, and we put cotton balls in our ears." But then she said this, "Paul, the reason we put cotton balls in our ears is because these are hard surfaces in this new facility. The music is loud and the music hurts our ears." So she said, that's the reason we do it. Now also, if you ask our preference, we wish we had an organ. We wish we had hymnals. But you need to know, we stand, we sing, we clap, because we're seeing those young people, we're seeing those empty nesters, we're seeing those teenagers. All these people are coming to Jesus. If this music brings them to Jesus, then we need to sing it. Now, when you're willing to sacrifice your music for the mission, that's a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ. Okay? And so that's what you're trying to get, where people say, it's not about me, it's not about my agenda, it's not about what I want, but it's about the mission and vision. Now, as our churches changed and grew, I would go to church, preach in their church, and be very honest with them, they were doing contemporary music, and I did not like it. Okay? I'm now 75. But here's what I told them. If I like your worship, you are in deep trouble. Okay? Because all you're going to attract are older Christians for the most part. Now, in this day and age, there are some millennials and Generation Z, if they are Christians, that want, 4th century chants, and there's some, but there are others who want music that fries the paint. I understand that. But a fully devoted, now I'm picking on music. It could be anything. Okay? My time, my service. Don't cover up the stained glass window. That is more important than reaching people for Jesus. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Are we mission driven? Okay. Number 2, fellowship and shepherding must be programmed. People must be cared for as they participate in ministry. So the more you grow, the more it's important that you're developing a whole team of people to do shepherding and get people in groups. Notice number 3, intentional assimilation of visitors. Notice the goal. The goal of assimilation or connection is mobilization. One of the reasons why 20% of the people do 80% of work in most churches is we bugged them till they became covenant partners. Then we left them alone. Okay. And we need to understand, no, you don't leave people alone. You in the connection ministry, as that's where you begin to create a high expectation church. If you're coming here, here's what we expect of you. We used to tell people in our church, we expect you in a worship service. We give you a choice of 11. We expect you in a group. You can either go to an adult Sunday school class or small groups, because we had both. And we expect you to do ministry. Now, if you're not doing those, we understand that, but you need to understand from that perspective, you're not meeting what we think a good person who wants to follow Jesus should be doing. So we let people know that. Now, sometimes we got people who were hurt, they had been wounded. We let them sit for 6 months. In fact, other times we get people who had done everything in this other small church, and they come in and say, I am tired. I'd say, take 6 months off. Because I knew if I told them 6 months, they'd be back working in 3. Because that was in their heart. Okay? But intention is mobilization. Number 4, church vision continually kept before the people. I believe every worship service you should have in it an urgency moment where you keep saying, hey, people don't know Jesus. This is what's in our community. One of the best tools you have to create urgency is this, where you take you have some staff that can do this, but for solo pastors, take your iPhone and go out and do 1-minute interviews, interview principals, and say, how many kids at your school come to school hungry? How many kids, or tell me about the kids that when they get home for the weekend, there's no food on the weekend because there's none in the house. Or tell me, or go down to a social worker, how many young women in this county are pregnant and not sure whether they're going to have an abortion or going to have a baby? Or tell me about the foster system. A church in Denver that I knew about, they took a bunch of their people into the county building. It's the largest county it's Jefferson County. I think it's the largest county or at least the most populated county in Colorado. And up on the wall were nothing but about 300 T-shirts. About a third to almost a half of the T-shirts, I don't remember exactly, but a significant number were red. All the others were white. And they said, what's the T-shirts for? And they said, the number of T-shirts there are the number of children who are currently in foster homes. Well, what are the red ones for? They're the ones that have died this year in foster homes. That's an urgency moment. And that's what you keep saying every Sunday. Every worship service should have an urgency moment and a vision moment. Hey, this is what God's doing. Here's the story. There's 30-second stories, 40-second stories. Every Sunday, you kept it before the people. Communications maintained to the level of redundancy. And, of course, around here, everybody talks about communication. And there's a number of issues, but 2 things I want to talk about. Sociologists, depending on who you read, say all of us get 100 to 200,000 messages a day. And all of us have learned to be selective listeners. So I don't care who you are. That's all. We're all that way. So that's one issue. But number 2, you're trying to advertise everything. Why? I mean, say if this is your ministry, it's up to you. You can phone people, you can call people, you can text people. So you begin to cut down the messages, and the ones that help you most. The ministry you want to focus on in terms of mission and vision, they're the messages you create. The idea that everybody should expect my thing should be done, again, is really Apple thinking. That's really small church thinking, as opposed to being an orange. The senior pastor leads the staff, board, and congregation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The board affirms rather than granting permission. There are changed expectations of how ministry is done. We're going to you'll see some of that in the report. The church is honeycombed with third places. That means people always want to be in a group. Now, third places, let me talk about this. That's a social term. When you were born, when you and I are born into the family, we were born into our first place. In your first place, acceptance is automatic. I mean, we have the saying, if your mother doesn't love you, you're in deep trouble. Some very irresponsible reporter said to Ted Bundy's mother after he was executed, in light of all that you know now, what do you think of your son? And her response is, well, somewhere underneath there was a good boy. Only a mother says that. So in family, your acceptance is automatic. When you go to school or work, your acceptance is conditional. All high school students realize that if I can't get connected with a certain group in school, my high school years are going to be really bad. So I have to earn that acceptance, whether it's with the musicians, the computer people, the scholars, whatever. I mean, in Denver, it was even kids that were into rodeoing, And I just found out my granddaughter, they actually have now a competition in Colorado for gamers. Interscholastic competition for gamers. Why? Because that's where they get their identity. They're earning a relationship to be known. Okay. Now, everybody is looking for a third place. Some place where I can go where people will accept me for who I am. Best illustration of a third place is Cheers. Everybody in Cheers were losers. Sam's a washed-up ball player. Cliff and Norm, definite losers. Carter's a loser. Frazier's a loser. They fight with each other, but they accept each other. In fact, they were very suspicious when a stranger walked in the bar. Okay. And what people are looking for, this is why as you help people make friends in your connection process, then you help put them in groups. They don't go into groups that are established. They need to have groups now that are coming out of the people who are coming through that process so that they are having their third place. By the way, many churches now who are getting involved in mission, many churches that have small groups, because in Sticky Church, Larry Osborne says small groups should meet for 10 weeks. Most churches I go into, they do 10-week terms. And so churches have said, now, if we're going to be about reaching lost people, the 9th week you don't meet in the home or a church, you go out and do ministry together. And the 10th week you don't meet in home and church, you go out and you do something evangelistic together. Okay, so every group has that element to it, but it's a place where people accept me. So that's what number 9 is. And then number 10, mission and vision is placed above self-interest. Every congregational behavior is evaluated in light of the mission and vision. If it is found wanting, it's either changed or discarded. That's bringing everything into alignment. So you need to know that what I'm going to be recommending is to help your church begin to regain that sense of large church behaviors that help things get accomplished. Now, I want to go back to number 1, and you say culturally assumed ministries to transform consumers. What's that mean? What's that look like? So, there's many ways you can define consumerism. I want to define it in terms of expectations. My wife and I have about three restaurants in Sacramento that are our favorites. And when we go there, we generally do not need a menu, because we know before we get there what we're going to order, because number 1, we like it, and number 2, we expect it to taste exactly like it did the last time. Worst thing a restaurant, you get a new chef that tinkers with the recipes. One of my favorite things are waffles. It's the most inconsistent things restaurants do. But there's one restaurant we've gone to now for 20 years. When we go there for breakfast, she said, "Are you getting the usual?" Yeah. And it includes waffles. Because for 20 years, no matter who was doing the cooking, they tasted the same every time. Now, we don't have any more Kmarts, but one of the reasons why we stopped going to Kmart, we had different expectations. Flashing blue lights and no one to wait on us. Okay. Now, once in a while, my wife tricks me, and I have to go to Walmart with her. Okay. So when we go, I do the typical male thing. I look at my watch, and I say, "When will you be back at the cash register?" Okay. Now, that's a fantasy. Okay. It hasn't happened yet, but I still have hope. Okay. So I have a half hour, 45 minutes to kill at Walmart. And every once in a while, because we travel some in different Walmarts, I wonder if this Walmart will meet my expectations. So try to think, what's one of the most obscure things they must sell at Walmart? So I go up to a clerk, who, in at least every Walmart I've been in, I've been able to find, and say, "Do you have X?" Whatever it is. And I have yet to be disappointed. They either take me there, or they call and say, "Someone will meet you on aisle 19. Now, I don't buy it. I just want to see if they'll do it. Okay. Now, I walk into Neiman Marcus, I have different expectations. 3 people to wait on me, but when they see how I'm dressed, they don't talk to me. Okay. Now, I don't care if you're Presbyterian in St. Louis, Lutheran in Atlanta, Charismatic in Los Angeles, Baptist in Memphis, Methodist in Nashville, Independent Christian Church in New York City. When people walk into church, they all have the same expectations. And as a missionary, if you are starting with people if you don't start where what they expect, they don't come back. So, to look at that list, turn with me to page 3. Down at the bottom, it says one model of ministries. Why do you do those ministries? Is to convert consumers into committed disciples of Jesus Christ. A committed disciple is, I will sacrifice my desires for what it does to help us achieve the mission and who it helps us to achieve the mission. Which ones? I want to meet culturally determined ministry expectations. Number one, worship and music. Now, that is a biggie, and it is still a biggie, and the worship wars are still continuing. Okay? So, I want to talk about the biggest problem all of us have with music. I don't care if you're 12, 18, or 90. Problem all of us have is that all of us like the music that was being played and sung when we had our most significant encounter with Jesus. And we want to impose that on everybody else. So, when I do these weekends, I don't mind doing them in the fall, because when I get back to the motel tonight, Saturday night, this is a busy schedule, but it's down. I mean, once we're done here, for the most part, it's done till tomorrow. And in the fall, there's either usually football on or basketball on or whatever. Or I like ice hockey, whatever. But when you get into the late spring, there's nothing I want to see. So I go in the motel, and I get the remote, because I'm a man. I just start going through 100 channels. And it amazes me how in 100 channels I can't find anything I like. So since I'm a man, I do it again. Go through the 100 channels again. But the fourth time, because I'm a little slow, all of a sudden I stop. And there's this usually big room. The women in it have really high hair, most of which is blue. Okay. The men have horrible toupees. And they're sitting around a guy playing the piano, whose name is Bill. So I've come out of the closet. I watch the Gaithers. Okay. And even though they push DVD after DVD after DVD, I watch. Now there's a reason for that. When I was 5 years old, my nearest sibling actually, was a senior in high school. And then the brother ahead of him was in college. My brother, who was a senior in high school, went to a Christian camp. And during that week, encountered Jesus Christ, and not only said, I want to be a Christian, said, I want to go to what we then called Bible college or Christian college and become a missionary. Now, as you know, in the Christian life, missionaries are at the top of the pecking order. They are more spiritual than pastors. And even among missionaries, there's pecking order. Usually the less clothes the natives have, the more spiritual they are. I mean, that's the way it goes at that point. Okay. You got the pecking order. And he wanted to be a missionary. My brother and father went to pick him up on the weekend, and at that service, my brother becomes a believer in Jesus Christ, wants to go to Christian college and become a missionary. Now, my parents, who were Christians but had gotten away from Jesus, it just revolutionized our family. And in our church, which is a small town, they come back, and here are these two converts. They're going to be missionaries. I mean, my brothers were the talk of the church, you know. The brother I liked, who was the senior in high school, was in a quartet. And he and three other young guys his age sang almost every Sunday in church as a quartet. My mother would play the piano, and they would rehearse at her house. And I would sit on the couch waiting for the day that I could be in a quartet, that I could sing, and that everybody would talk about me the way they talked about my brother. So my first encounter with music, as at the time that God was also saying to me at age 5, I want you to be a preacher. That was what in my mind. I want you to be a preacher. Okay. And Sundays I come home, get the piano stool out, preach, and everybody leave the room. But I want you to be a preacher. My music was quartet music. Well, if you look at the Gaithers, it's basically all quartet music. That's why I like it. Okay. Now I also like a good Presbyterian service. I mean, I like an organ. I like the Gloria Patri. I like to hear a good choir. But as I've often said, in this day and age, if I get my way, we're in trouble. Now, the good news is for your church is you are offering people options. However, in both options, I would argue, and it's going to be in the report, that both services need to have a contemporary feel. Because even people my age, when we go to some musical event, we want it to move. We want it to have a sense of creativity. We want to have a sense of drawing us into the experience, regardless of the music. You know, my wife and I, because of YouTube, we've never seen him anyplace else, have become fans of Andre Rieu. They're playing a lot of classical music, but they're doing it in a way that there's a sense of movement, there's life, there's and we get energized by watching the audience. And so I'm glad you have a traditional service. But that traditional service, to quote Emerald, needs to be kicked up a notch. Needs to be far more participatory, needs to be creative, needs to be something that every Sunday is an experience from God. And the same thing needs to be true in the contemporary service. Now, by the way, I'm going to say in the report, you need to take the 8:30 service and the 11 o'clock service and have one 9:30 service. Folks, it's time to end catering to all of these individual agendas. It's time to say we want to have a service. We want, because first basic reason is to have critical mass so that when people walk in, it's at least half full. When I watched your sermons I watched about 6 sermons on the video, and I didn't care who was preaching. When that camera looked down and I saw 10 empty pews, if I'm a guest, probably not even going to come to church because already I could tell there's nobody there. Okay? It's if we want people to come, and by the way, our church in Denver, we were so committed to seniors that we had a whole ministry led by 50 seniors, most of them in their 70s and 80s, and 50 what I call empty nesters, because people 45 to 65, because they care about older people, because parents are becoming dependent on them, they're beginning to care for their parents. Those 100 people touch 2,000 seniors every month, unchurched. And they would put on a seniors luncheon that would be 500-600. And I went to the guy who ran it, had been a construction guy and a union boss. He and his wife were sitting in their Barca lounges as empty nesters, watching Billy Graham, drinking beer, and accepted Christ. Billy Graham said, "Go back to your church," and always said at the end, "Go back to your church." Well, they went back to their little. I'm on tape. Went back to it was a mainline church, not Presbyterian, but little church of 50, highly liberal, and there were no kids, and so they said to the pastor, "Can we start a Sunday school?" Pastor, yeah. Well, in a year they had more kids in Sunday school than were in the church. One day the pastor said to him, he said, "I'm glad you got all these kids, but you got to realize what you're teaching them's not right. Jesus didn't come out of the grave. Jonah didn't come out of the whale. He didn't turn water into wine." Now, all Bob knew, he was a construction worker. He knew he loved Jesus, and he knew this guy was wrong. So he told him to go to hell. He was probably going there anyway, but he said, and they left. And they got down in a cult in Denver. They're helping people, but the cult leader says, if you ever go back into real church again, God will strike you dead. The cult implodes. They come to our church. I don't know any of this background. And one cold morning in December, I'm walking across the parking lot, and there's one car there at 7:45 for 8 o'clock service. I figure it's got to be a visitor because, regular people don't show up that early. Knock on the window. I said, "Hi, I'm Paul. I met you." He says, "I'm Bob. This is Cynthia." I said, "Would you like to come into this service in the fellowship hall?" And because I said fellowship hall, it wasn't a church, they figured God wouldn't strike them dead. So they come in the fellowship hall. And for 5 years, I watch them grow. They come to my Bible study. They're anything I want. So one day we said to Bob, "Would you go and teach our senior adults?" 20 people, 19 women, 1 man, because women live longer. And I could tell you why, but it's so politically incorrect you won't listen to anything else I say at that point. Okay. Would you go teach them? And when he went in, those people thought Bob is going to teach us a class. He's going to visit us in the hospital, and he's going to look at pictures of our grandkids, which he did. But within 2 or 3 years, the class had gotten to 50. 45 women, 5 men. And he began to develop this whole team of empty nesters. And those 100 people began to reach out to these seniors. I went to him one day and I said, Bob, I am so impressed with what you're doing. How are you doing it? And his response was, Paul, you went to seminary, you'll never figure it out. He said, I know I can go any place where seniors are. Retirement communities, nursing homes, whatever it is, or just where they're by themselves, and at least 10% of the people there have no visitors, no mail, no one to talk to. Today we'd say no personal email. And I go to the gatekeepers, I find out who they are, and I go meet them and I say, we're having our church next Saturday, we're having our senior luncheon. Would you like to come? And they say, oh, yeah, anything to get out of prison. And he then trained his seniors. Now, you don't sit with each other. You talk to them. You do this. You network with them. And they began that ministry, and it began to grow. Like I said, they get 500 or 600 out. And every time there would be a low-key approach to the gospel and who Jesus is. And for about a period of 10 years, this program went, after I left, for about another 15 years, but for about 10 years, almost every month, sometimes 2 or 3 times a month, Bob would call me and say, Paul, I just want to know some 75-year-old man accepted Jesus. Some 80-year-old woman just accepted Jesus. One night he called me and said, some woman, 99 years of age, accepted Jesus. Called me back 6 months later and said, she just went home to meet her father. So seniors are important. Our seniors said, because, they said this, Paul, we don't want to go on any more trips because we have 2,000 phone calls to make every month, and we have 2,000 people to pray for. When I speak to seniors, I preach on Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel, you realize, was at least 90 years of age when he's in the lion's den. He was not eating because it was old meat. Okay, no, it was a miracle. Stand that, okay. But you realize Daniel's commitment to risk was the same as a teenager in chapter 1. He knew the consequences before he ever did it, that it probably meant death. Number 2, the reason he was at risk is because he was out working all the younger people. And number 3, he had moved from a Babylonian bureaucracy to a Persian bureaucracy. He had gone from Apple to Microsoft. And because we were able to find a culturally relevant ministry for our seniors, they didn't care about the carpet, the color of the wall, whether the water fountain was working or not. Now, we worked to make all that happen as much as possible because they had a mission.